Egypt's ancient secrets, revealed. Land of pyramids and hidden treasures, ancient Egyptians left us mystery. Inscriptions told their grand history. Hieroglyphs. A scholar cracked the code. Jean-François Champollion deciphered these silent symbols. A lost civilization was brought back to life. Today, science studies those who wrote these texts. They were priests, scribes, artists, builders for pharaohs. In southern Egypt, a palace filled with symbols, the largest tomb in the country for a key figure. How was this monument built? We'll explore this labyrinth for latest hieroglyph secrets. We leave Memphis, today's Cairo, heading 700 kilometers up the Nile. To reach Thebes, modern Luxor, near the old religious capital stands Karnak Temple. Built nearly 4,000 years ago, it was a major religious site, an architectural marvel for sacred rituals. Stones covered in strange signs, hieroglyphs, sacred carvings. Egyptians believed these were words from the gods. Hieroglyphs might be the longest used writing ever, used for over 3,000 years, ending with Christianity. After that, their sacred writings couldn't survive. These stones went mute. We lost their thoughts and beliefs. Uncover afterlife beliefs. Cross the Nile, into the realm of the dead. Here, pharaohs dug tombs into mountainsides. The Theban necropolis is vast, beyond the Valley of Kings. Countless monuments stand, like Queen Hatshepsut's temple, and another tomb, the largest, most enigmatic found. The size is staggering, yet not a pharaoh's tomb. Archaeologists call it TT33, a prize for deciphers. For 17 years, Professor Klott has studied TT33. With Egyptologists Sylvia and Isabel, they copy, translate, interpret. Today is huge. After 2 years, they can re-enter. They have 4 weeks to find treasures and save texts. This tomb covers half a hectare, a vast surface for study. Its complex layout trapped explorers since the 19th century. Known as a curious, cursed, and dangerous place. Large colonies of bats lived here. When people entered, bats flew out, causing accidents. With only candles, some fell down shafts. Bat wings blew out their candles. Whose tomb is this? Here he is, Padiamenipae. 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 Images show him greeting visitors at the entrance. His name and image are everywhere. This is his final resting place, no doubt. For 100 years, visits stopped at room 3. Archaeologist Maspero built a wall to block room 4. A note from Maspero says, "We walled Padiamenipae's tomb because of bats. I hope we'll find out who Padiamenipae was." He used this to get the tomb reopened. In December 2005, Klott got authorization to break the wall. He entered a space closed for a century. Decomposed bats filled the air with ammonia, unbreathable. Walls and floors were degraded, but he saw a priceless treasure. A greeting message was discovered. I remember tears when I saw it, an appeal to the living. "O you who are on earth, those born, and those who will be born." It's incredible. It even addresses those who come to stroll, visiting the necropolis. Not bad. Those who come to look at ancient tombs. From the 7th century BCE, tombs already 2,000 years old. Or those who come looking for spells. That's us. That's us. I must admit, I read that. I was moved to tears. Those looking for spells. And he continues, "May they observe what's in this tomb and receive a blessing from the god Ammonius if they respect it." He asks us to repair any damage. A very daring, direct message. A message from deep time. Padiamenipae asks us to keep his tomb in good repair. Visionary or megalomaniac? How could he imagine his own legacy so deeply? Isabel and Sylvia have studied for over 10 years. exploring corridors to the burial chamber. Their goal, answers about Padiamenipae. The tomb style places it around 700 BCE. To learn more, they must capture 360-degree images. A little lower. That's it. We're good. I started here in room 4. We're now in room 5. I'll survey the tomb until the last room. They're photographing every surface in each room to create the first complete virtual tour of Padiamenipae's tomb. This is how it was all. We'll start photogrammetry, aligning images into a dot cloud. Software will align the images. This process involves identifying matching pixels across different images. Next, we move on to the second stage, which is meshing. In this phase, the software takes those millions of dots and connects them using small triangles. This is what gives the model its sense of volume. So, we're essentially transitioning from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional representation. Once the model is created, we proceed to the final step called compositing. Here, we'll determine the camera's movement, along with the lighting and the overall mood of the lighting. And finally, we render the actual tomb itself. In this view, the camera is positioned on the outside, allowing us to see the tomb's exterior dimensions, complete with its architecture and depth. Alternatively, we can take a virtual tour with the camera placed inside the tomb. Here, we're observing room 1 as it appears today in a state of some decay. These two camera perspectives are quite complementary because they help us figure out the best way to work within the tomb. This marks an incredible first, a virtual exploration experience. For the very first time, we can explore the enormous maze that makes up TT33. It contains 22 rooms, countless passages, and intricately connected galleries. All of this is spread across 3 levels, buried more than 20 meters deep beneath the desert sands. That's 2,622 square meters of decorated walls. Every single one of them is covered in hieroglyphs. But how will our archaeologists make sense of these inscriptions, which have been damaged by centuries, by earthquakes, by looters, and by the black smoke from their oil lamps? Only by deciphering the writings on the walls will we learn more about the owner of this tomb. We know his name, but what kind of influence did he possess to build a resting place even grander and faster than that of a pharaoh? Here we see his name, Padiamenipae, with a special marker indicating it refers to a man. And his main title, Riri Reb and Riri Teb, which translates to lector priest and chief, or perhaps lector priest and master of ceremonies. Padiamenipae must have had a deep understanding of ancient Egypt's religious history and its sacred texts. He is mentioned here as a royal scribe. He served as the connection between, let's say, those who worked in the library, devising rituals, thinking, and cataloging papyri, before presenting them to the public and leading religious ceremonies. You could say he bridged the gap between religious theory and religious practice, and with what support? To reassure the Egyptian people, because the Egyptians were deeply fearful. You didn't construct structures like this without a significant fear of death. A statue of Padiamenipae in the Cairo Museum depicts him as a scribe, thus part of the educated elite who held considerable power over the rest of the population who could not read or write. We can find the most famous member of this privileged group, the Guardians of Sacred Knowledge, at the Louvre Museum in Paris. It's the seated scribe statue, a masterpiece from the Egyptian Antiquities Department. Christophe Barbiton is a highly respected specialist in hieroglyphics. Egypt was managed by an educated elite, whom we refer to as scribes because they possessed the ability to write, distinguishing them from others. This educated elite oversaw a large population of farmers, as Egyptian civilization was both agrarian and administrative, an unusual combination. But this was the way things were for 3,000 years. The scribe's primary duties involved keeping records and writing letters, essentially administrative tasks. The more learned among them wrote literature, as there was an Egyptian literary tradition in the modern sense, while others managed libraries. Scribes wrote using a reed tool, the end of which was shaped somewhat like a brush, dipped in either black or red ink. The black ink was made from charcoal with a binder. The red ink was ochre, sourced from the earth, and they worked with different red brushes depending on whether they were writing or painting. Hieroglyphs generally read from right to left. To determine the direction, you can take a pictorial hieroglyph such as a quail chick. Since it's facing left, you read from left to right and also down in columns. In other inscriptions, the direction might be reversed. For instance, around a doorway or niche, you might find signs on the left side facing right to left, or vice versa. This is monumental writing that pairs exceptionally well with architecture. Let's return to the Palace of Hieroglyphs. Sylvia and Audi, along with Isabel Region, are putting their epigraphic skills to the test, attempting to interpret the messages left by Padiamenipae for future visitors. All the clues needed for understanding are right there, etched in stone before their eyes. Epigraphy is the process of copying inscriptions for subsequent study. The areas you see here in gray with the pencil marks indicate areas with missing information that I cannot see on the wall, even with my best efforts using my flashlight. This is because salt crystals have formed and damaged the inscriptions, or sections of the wall have simply crumbled away. I'm using light from a low angle to determine if a mark I observe on the wall is actually a hieroglyph or just a crack in the wall. Sylvia has a very limited time within the tomb, but her high-definition photographs will allow her to continue her deciphering work back in the lab. We'll capture around 500 images of this wall. We use low-angled lighting and high definition, which lets us zoom in on the inscriptions to gather as much information as possible. While both systems are effective, it's essential to have what I call a physical interaction with the inscriptions, trying to read them by observing the play of light and shadow. This helps to discern the subtle details that are legible, even with high-definition photos, especially on walls that are as damaged as these. And as you copy the text, you have the opportunity to begin contemplating and translating the words you are currently transcribing. Linguistic skills alone are insufficient. To truly grasp this writing, you need knowledge of its history, its origins, and its development. It first appeared around 3200 BCE and was used for nearly 3,500 years, gradually fading after the Roman Empire established political and religious dominance over ancient Egypt. To understand why hieroglyphs eventually ceased to be used, we must look back to the end of the 4th century CE, when the Roman Empire, which extended as far as Egypt, fully embraced Christianity. In the year 380, Emperor Theodosius issued a decree effectively banning all pagan worship. Egypt lost its educated elite, who had mastered the knowledge of hieroglyphs. This writing system, which had been in use for 3,000 years, fell into a deep slumber for 1,400 years. But everything shifted at the dawn of the 19th century. In 1798, General Bonaparte landed in Egypt. His military campaign served a dual purpose as a scientific expedition, aiming to study the country's history and geography. It is in Cairo that one of the original copies of the expedition's account, Description de l'Egypte, is preserved. Within this monumental work, Egyptologists discovered one of the rare depictions of Padiamenipae's tomb, then known as the Great Sri Range. Navigating this labyrinth, Bonaparte scholars explored and created highly detailed plans of the tomb, but they were unable to comprehend the hieroglyphs on its walls. However, it was during this expedition that a soldier made a significant discovery in the north of the country, in the small town of Rosetta, which would pave the way for deciphering hieroglyphs. Lieutenant Bouchard found a stele dating from the 2nd century BCE, inscribed with a decree by King Ptolemy V. The text was presented in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic Egyptian, a simplified cursive form of hieroglyphs, and ancient Greek. Here is a copy of the plate of the Rosetta Stone from Description de l'Egypte. They immediately recognized the profound significance of this trilingual stone. Within the hieroglyphic section, there's the cartouche of Ptolemy V, which served as a key reference, helping them understand that cartouches contained royal names. And at the bottom of the stone, the Greek version allowed for a word-for-word comparison between Greek and Egyptian phrases. Consequently, these inscriptions enabled scholars to establish numerous equivalents and formed the basis for research into deciphering hieroglyphs. Before we could read hieroglyphs, viewing these monuments was a mystery, leading to much esoteric interpretation with people believing they were all symbolic. They were thought to lack phonetic values, so one could look at these monuments without truly understanding them. This continued until Champollion arrived and unlocked this key, this mystery. You can see this cartouche, which is the oval shape enclosing the king's name, and here you see Ptolemy. So, this is the name of Ptolemy, and it's undoubtedly one of the most crucial names in Egyptology, not for his historical importance, but because his name appeared on the Rosetta Stone, making it the first name to be deciphered. But how was Champollion able to decipher this long-lost language from just a few signs carved on a stone? Step 1. We know he was proficient in ancient Greek, so he could read the name Ptolemaios in Greek on the Rosetta Stone and then identify the cartouche of the same Ptolemy written in hieroglyphs. Step 2. This allowed him to match the 7 letters. Ptolemaios corresponds to the 7 hieroglyphs. Once he could decipher the cartouche of Queen Cleopatra in the same manner, he identified the 3 hieroglyphs LOP, already found in the Ptolemy cartouche, and completed the word with the remaining letters KATRA, corresponding to 6 as yet unidentified hieroglyphs. Step 2. The cartouches contained phonetic transcriptions of Greek names. But what about the names of pharaohs who ruled before Greek influence? And that's where Champollion's brilliance came into play. The young scholar was a gifted linguist, having studied Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and Aramaic by the age of 13. He soon developed an intuition that studying Coptic would be essential for understanding the language of ancient Egyptians. But why Coptic? At the beginning of the Common Era, Egyptians began transcribing their language using the Greek alphabet, abandoning the hieroglyphic system. This is what we call Coptic. The Coptic language and writing continued to be used in the liturgical texts of Coptic Orthodox Christians. In the 19th century, Champollion was able to read and write Coptic. He utilized this continuity between the language transcribed by hieroglyphs and Coptic texts to unlock the secret of hieroglyphs. So, thanks to Coptic, Champollion was able to translate a new cartouche, one where he recognized the letter S. And the first hieroglyph in the name appeared to be a sun, which in Coptic is pronounced Ra. He was still missing the middle hieroglyph. Could it be Ramesses, the most renowned of the pharaohs, whose name was remembered even after the disappearance of hieroglyphs? Champollion immediately turned his attention to another cartouche. His first symbol was an ibis, representing the god Thoth. So, if his hypothesis about Ramesses was correct, the second symbol might be an M, and he already knew the last symbol was S, thus Thothmes. Naturally, Thutmose, another prominent pharaoh mentioned in Greek texts. There was no longer any doubt. The young French scholar could now read hieroglyphs, because beyond just proper nouns, he even deduced the very nature of the Egyptian language, explaining it as follows. It's an incredibly intricate system, a writing that functions on multiple levels at once. Figurative, symbolic, and phonetic, all within a single text, a single sentence. A whole new world suddenly opened up for him. After a decade of dedicated research, filled with both breakthroughs and dead ends, Champollion had finally cracked the hieroglyphic code. Returning, he showed no sign of surprise. Next, we proceeded to the gallery. This particular tomb stands out as a prime example of ancient Egyptian artistry and importance, especially due to the significant writings inscribed on its walls. These writings are crucial funerary texts, essentially collections of spells and incantations designed to assist the deceased in navigating the afterlife. Therefore, this tomb is far more than just a final resting place. Padiamenipae transformed it into an extraordinary library, one that remains unparalleled in all of Egypt. By compiling this comprehensive collection of ancient Egyptian sacred writings, he effectively became a true encyclopedist. Studying these texts offers profound insights into how ancient Egyptians perceived the world, as they recount the monumental myths of this civilization. Let's delve into the myth of the sun god, Ra. He is depicted as one who, each night, valiantly battles monstrous creatures intent on trapping him in eternal darkness. For this particular endeavor, Isabel Rigion has taken on the challenge of deciphering the remaining portion of the text. Here we encounter the initial hour described in the Book of Amjuet. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, submerging into the earth's depths. Aboard his night vessel, accompanied by divine youths, he appears in his nocturnal form, bearing a ram's head. And before him, in a posture of profound adoration, kneels Padiamenipae, whose specific titular names are clearly indicated here. The sun god's night vessel is supported by an entire crew, whose purpose is to ensure his safe passage until the moment he will reemerge at dawn. Alongside several other deities, we can discern three distinct figures here. These four individuals are specifically tasked with the crucial role of hauling the boat. They diligently pull the vessel through challenging passages where navigation is particularly difficult. It makes one wonder, what exactly is Padiamenipae doing aboard the sun god's night vessel? As a devoted follower of Ra, what is his specific objective in defending him? As the hours progress, various significant events unfold. Padiamenipae is actively engaged, assisting in hauling the sun god's boat and combating Apophis, the monstrous serpent aiming to impede the boat's forward momentum. He participates with great vigor in this journey and even performs a ritualistic dance to honor the sun god. Should Padiamenipae prove unable to guide the sun god's boat safely through the 12 hours of the night, the sun will fail to rise, signifying the catastrophic end of the world. Consequently, every morning as the sun reappears, all living creatures prostrate themselves before the sun god to commemorate his triumph, representing the ultimate victory of life over death. Padiamenipae's personal interpretation of this narrative is remarkably distinctive. Within the sacred text, he has deliberately inserted his own name and title. This highlights not only his intellectual presence but also a clear desire for self-promotion. According to an established tradition dating back to the Old Kingdom, it is typically the pharaoh who is depicted within the boat, in a position of reverence before Ra. So, the question arises, why has Padiamenipae assumed the pharaoh's traditional place? Is it driven by pride or by profound devotion? The work of Abel Rigel offers a compelling answer to this. He is presented as replacing the king in the role of Ra's defender, ensuring that after his own passing, he will ascend each day with the sun's rebirth. This serves as a method of securing eternal life within the realm of the deceased. However, merely ensuring the sun god's protection is insufficient. He must also secure the favor of Osiris, the deity presiding over the afterlife. We are now in Chamber 9 of the tomb, where 2 walls are dedicated to the renowned weighing of the heart ceremony. Here, Padiamenipae addresses the assembly of 42 deities, the assessors who assist Osiris in judging the souls of the departed upon their arrival in the afterlife. Padiamenipae is presented addressing the 42 deities, the assessors of Osiris, who aid the god in judging the deceased as they enter the afterlife. Here we see Padiamenipae's name, followed by a declaration of innocence. He asserts that he has not committed a list of wrongful actions. He states he has not taken a life, engaged in theft, uttered falsehoods, or succumbed to corruption, and this is repeated 42 times. Once again, Padiamenipae is prominently featured at the center of the narrative. This time, within the scene depicting the weighing of the heart, arguably the most celebrated segment of the Book of the Dead. After placing a feather on one side of the balance, Anubis, the god of death and ruler of the necropolis, positions the deceased's heart on the opposite pan. For the deceased to continue their existence in the afterlife, their heart must be demonstrably as light as the feather, a necropolis, where the deceased's heart is placed in the afterlife, proving they have abstained from any malevolent actions. Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, meticulously records the outcome of this crucial weighing on his tablet. At his feet lies Ammit, the devourer of the dead, a fearsome deity tasked with consuming the heart of any deceased individual whose heart is found not to be pure, meaning it carries the burden of wrongdoing. In such a regrettable scenario, the deceased is denied continued existence in the afterlife. The entirety of this solemn proceeding unfolds in the presence of Osiris, the god of the dead and the presiding judge of this divine tribunal. He ultimately determines whether the deceased is deemed pure or condemned to eternal oblivion. It prompts the question, why does Padiamenipae exhibit such profound devotion to Osiris? Was he actively seeking to gain the god's favor? The significance extends even further. Egyptologists have uncovered numerous inscriptions bearing his name on the tomb's interior walls. But what is the underlying reason for this? For him and his contemporaries, hieroglyphs were believed to possess inherent magical power. As long as visitors to the tomb continued to speak his name, he was assured of continued existence in the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, the spoken and written word held immense, almost supernatural power. Words were considered inherently magical. The act of inscribing something was thought to imbue it with significant power, and vocalizing it further amplified this potency, effectively ritualizing the entire process. This concept mirrors how, in many magical practices even today, regardless of geographical location, the act of naming someone grants a form of power over them. Words truly possess power. One of the foundational creation myths of the ancient Egyptians involved a god conceiving a thought. This thought was then spoken, and it manifested into reality. This notion bears a striking resemblance to the core principles found in many monotheistic religions today, specifically the concept of the power inherent in the word. I possess the hidden knowledge of hieroglyphs, along with mastery over various forms of magic. Nothing remains beyond my grasp. Thus, we observe remarkable craftsmanship. It is exceptionally rare for an artisan to be recognized for their profound understanding of hieroglyphs, granting them access to magical abilities. Not only does he command magic, but he also demonstrably proves this on the stele through a rather intriguing process that has hitherto gone unnoticed. Examining the lower section of the stele reveals individuals presenting offerings, bringing sustenance to the deceased couple, a common depiction. However, upon closer inspection of the offering bearer's feet, one notices that they have been deliberately hammered. It's quite uncommon for an artisan to be recognized for their exceptional skill with hieroglyphs and also possess the ability to wield magic. And not only does he command magical abilities, but he also demonstrates this on the stele through a fascinating process that has gone unnoticed until this day. If you examine the base of the stele, you'll see offering bearers presenting food to the departed couple, a typical depiction. However, when you observe the feet of these offering bearers, they appear to be hammered. Imagine they could magically stick to the stone. Because in the world of hieroglyphs, these pictures were seen as living symbols. They held the power to leave the monument and halt its sacred purpose. This is how, through his magic, he ensured the figures remained bound to the stone. Hieroglyphs only gained magical power when carved in solid rock. Similarly, the deceased could only continue their existence in the afterlife if their body was preserved and resting within its tomb. When Padiamenipae decided to build this tomb, he had it excavated deep into the limestone. He began with a deep courtyard carved directly into the rock. As construction progressed, artisans began sculpting the walls, which gleamed as white as cathedral stone. To excavate and adorn a tomb of this magnitude must have demanded at least 20 years, likely more, and certainly under incredibly harsh conditions. We know that multiple teams were busy working on the tombs concurrently. While excavators were delving into the lower sections, scribes and artists were already busy decorating the initial rooms. This is how the work moved forward, yet it still took anywhere from 20 to 40 years. So, who were these skilled laborers and artisans who carved and decorated these tombs? To find that out, we need to journey back 8 centuries before Padiamenipae. We'll visit a unique archaeological site in Egypt, not far from the tomb TT33. We're standing in Deir el-Medina, a truly pivotal location in ancient Egypt. This was the village for the workmen who adorned the tombs of the kings and queens. And here, on the west bank of Thebes, is where the Valley of the Queens lies, which they also decorated. The Valley of the Kings is just beyond that, and the tombs of nobles and temples are also very nearby. So, people lived right here for hundreds of years. What's truly extraordinary isn't just the village, the tombs, and their places of worship. We also have a wealth of written records that shed light on these individuals. This allows us to identify specific people. This is where the essence of ancient Egypt truly comes to life. The village was established during the reign of Thutmose I, over 3,500 years ago. At the start of each week, the workmen would dedicate themselves to digging, building, and decorating the pharaoh's tombs. This is one of the sites where we've uncovered the most artifacts. By the end of the New Kingdom, the area was abandoned and eventually buried by the sands. The objects left behind by the inhabitants were later unearthed during excavations in the early 20th century. As part of an ongoing mission, researchers from around the globe gather here for 2 months each year. Their goal is to study the remains found in the village to gain a deeper understanding of the work done by these often forgotten craftsmen. This is our workspace, our laboratory, where the mission's researchers examine artifacts recovered directly from the site. Jerson is currently analyzing the various types of wood discovered here. Zachary and Ahmed are searching our database to determine the original use of an object, decipher its inscriptions, and understand its context on the site. This is known as an ostracon. Large numbers of these ostraca have been found at Deir el-Medina. They are fragments of limestone or pottery used as writing surfaces by the inhabitants. The ostraca provide immense insight into daily local life. They often record events or simply lists of workers and their families. Furthermore, some were used for practicing writing. This indicates that individuals here underwent training in writing, right in Deir el-Medina. Here, you can observe a red line that served as a guide for carving. However, you can see that the hand was not yet highly skilled. In contrast, this was created by someone with more advanced expertise, as the lines are sharp and depict the basket accurately. In Deir el-Medina, we can see distinct levels of specialization. This is naturally due to people continuously honing their craft. So, fathers would pass down their skills to their children. And it's likely that priests also provided assistance with reading and writing. But look at this ostracon, where people are fumbling as they practice their hieroglyphs, like a child learning their ABCs. Then, they gradually become much more proficient. They would meticulously copy classic texts repeatedly, until they not only knew them by heart but could also write every symbol. We presume that apprentices had models to follow. They had to repeatedly carve the same symbol until they could achieve the quality the teacher expected. Here, you see columns of very neatly written, small symbols, all perfectly spaced. This represents excellent work in copying. For everyday correspondence, they would use hieratic script. This is essentially hieroglyphs, but in a more simplified, flowing form. So, Much like hieroglyphs are like formal capital letters, hieratic is akin to joined-up cursive writing. While Egypt was largely illiterate, about 99%, the community of craftsmen at Deir el-Medina was composed almost entirely of literate individuals. The community was structured according to a strict social hierarchy. This system was designed to distribute work evenly among the tombs. Among the significant ostraca discovered at the site is one now housed in the British Museum. It contains detailed information about how work was organized at the royal tombs. Here, written in hieratic script, are the names of the workers, along with a record of their attendance and absences. Scribes maintained around 80 registers. They conducted roll calls to track who was present and who was not. We even have records of the excuses given by those who were absent, such as being away for a family funeral and so forth. Alongside the lists of workers are the names of the master builders, who supervised their work on the tombs. These master builders, whom we now refer to as architects, were responsible for coordinating both the construction of the tombs and their decoration with hieroglyphs. The entire process was meticulously planned. Initially, excavators would dig into a vein of limestone in the mountain. This vein had been carefully identified beforehand. It was incredibly arduous work. The men only had wooden mallets and bronze chisels to break through the rock. Steel tools simply did not exist in ancient Egypt 3,500 years ago. Then, others would clear out the debris from within the tomb. Following that, polishers would smooth the floors and walls. Next, still others would meticulously trace grids onto the walls. These grids served as the framework for the outline scribes, as if they were closely supervising the work on the tombs. These lead builders, whom we now refer to as architects, were responsible for overseeing both the tomb construction and their embellishment with hieroglyphic inscriptions, and every detail of this work was meticulously planned. Initially, excavators would tunnel into a limestone deposit within the mountain, a location that had been precisely identified beforehand. This was incredibly demanding labor. The workers were equipped only with wooden mallets and bronze chisels for extracting the stone. Metal tools were not yet available in ancient Egypt around 3,500 years ago. Then, others would clear out the debris from within the tomb. Following them were the polishers, tasked with smoothing the floors and walls. Subsequently, others would draw grid lines onto the walls. These lines served as the structure for the outline scribes. They used red ink to sketch out scenes and text. Next, the sculptors stepped in. They carefully carved the stone, using wooden mallets and fine copper chisels. Finally, the painters were the last to work. They brought the carved scenes and hieroglyphs to life with color. We found a ton of paintbrushes. They came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Each one was suited for a specific task. Some brushes were for applying stucco, or for laying down the first coat of paint on the walls. The brushes themselves are mostly made of plant fibers. They're folded over and then secured with cord. We also found a huge collection of pottery. These were used to hold inks and paints. This particular pot held red ink. The blue pigment? It came from grinding a specific mineral. Then it was refined using a buffer. You can still see traces of that blue pigment here. It was crucial for making the paint paste. And this paint paste? Well, it's what they used for painting. Elizabeth Beetles has set herself a monumental challenge. She's trying to put a name to every single artist. With the determination of a detective, this British paleography expert works tirelessly. She's determined to identify the painter of this tomb. It belonged to a scribe from the 19th dynasty. Everyone's handwriting is distinct. Each person's writing is truly unique. We know this to be true today, and it was exactly the same over 3,000 years ago. All of this knowledge about the person who created these hieroglyphs, who painted them, it's about getting to know him. So I have to try and find his handwriting style. It's in the shape of the signs, how he created them, and even how he felt things. Right now, I'm focusing on individual hieroglyphs. I'm trying to figure out their exact shapes. I take a super close-up photo. From that, I then draw digitally. I draw on my laptop, capturing the outlines of each brush stroke. Then I study the order of the brush strokes. I see which ones were layered on top of others. My long-term dream is to create an interactive database, a place where we can show people who we can name, who we know, who they married, even their children's names. This way, we learn so much about the people who were literate, those who could actually write. You can start to recognize the hands of the painters now. Each one had a special technique. It's marvelous because it allows you to connect the finished artwork directly with the individual artist. The last artists worked 8 centuries before the construction of Padiamenipae's tomb. Yet, their techniques and knowledge were passed down, from generation to generation, right up to those who decorated TT33. The mission continues. Egyptologists are aiming to reconstruct it, like a massive jigsaw puzzle. This magnificent decoration that time has shattered into countless pieces is from a very ancient time. To help them, they've enlisted archaeologist Simon Anuxai. This morning, while excavating the tomb's initial rooms, he uncovered more information about Padiamenipae. Here, while digging, we unearthed thousands of fragments from the walls, pillars, and ceiling. Our goal is to place them back in their original spots. This piece likely came from the southern wall of this room. Here we see Padiamenipae's mummy before his tomb. And here's a part of his title, Ririleb, or Rirideb, lectopriest and master of ceremonies. And here's the beginning of the name Padi. So, Padiamenipae must have been written right here. Just look at the detail in the ears and nostrils. For Steely, I had completely missed that. So, this is a representation of the very tomb we're in, right? In its perfect, original state. Padiamenipae must be incredibly happy in the afterlife. We're constantly mentioning his name. This is so incredibly moving. This fragment shows the face of one of Padiamenipae's funerary statuettes. They're known as Ashaptis. We recognize it because it's part of a series we already know. We've found other fragments from this same group. Ashaptis were placed in the tomb with the deceased. The tomb's original floor is about 50 centimeters below where we've been walking. We've been walking on that since we started working here. Here are those roughly 50 centimeters we've cleared in this section. You can see traces of ash and other debris layers. These rooms were almost certainly used by people living nearby, as temporary shelters, and as animal stables. The tomb's original floor is actually a wooden plank. While inside Padiamenipae's tomb, the grand wall and ceiling decorations are starting to take shape for the Egyptologists. Over at Rendero Medina, Cedric Larchie continues his own vital work, allowing the grand designs on the walls and ceiling to come into view for Egyptologists. Over Rendero Medina, Cedric Larchie continues his own work to get as much information as possible from those broken pottery pieces found at the site. We have a few items where we can barely make out some writing but can't quite tell what they say. To reveal the image, which is currently hidden, our restorers clean the surface, removing all the dust and grime. Then, we take photos right here on location and send them to our lab. There, our image enhancement specialist works to figure out what's actually on the pottery. The photograph is now on the computer. We apply digital processing, adjusting the colors and manipulating the light using various filters to bring out details invisible to the naked eye. On this particular piece, we see a clear depiction of the god Ptah, an important deity, especially revered in this area near Deir el-Medina. And after we've brought the image back, we create a drawing using our graphic tablet, which allows for publication. Caro is a graphic artist. Her role is to make visible what has become imperceptible to us, because the walls might have crumbled or the paint faded. With the drawings she produces, we can get a much clearer idea of what was originally painted on the walls. Alright, let's remove the photograph now. If we zoom in on specific areas, for instance, we can see the image with greater clarity. The benefit of this method, after we've taken the photo, is our ability to connect the lines, helping us imagine what the scenes originally looked like, particularly by comparing them to similar scenes discovered in other tombs. The carved walls of temples and tombs are not the only resources available to archaeologists for documenting the history of this civilization. 5 millennia ago, the Egyptians developed another writing material, made from the stalks of a plant that thrives along the Nile River, papyrus. During the 19th century, Egyptian papyri became highly sought-after collectibles. A man named Bernardino Drevetti, who was France's consul in Cairo, turned this into a lucrative business. The king of Piedmont paid him a substantial sum to assemble a collection for him. This archaeological treasure comprised statues, artifacts, and papyri that was so impressive that in 1824, the king was able to inaugurate a museum. And almost immediately after its opening, the museum curators had one primary goal. When the Drevetti collection was acquired, they hoped to bring the man who had unlocked the secrets of ancient Egypt to Turin. So, Champollion accepted their invitation. He was quite displeased that France hadn't secured the collection. But Turin had. And thus, he's credited with the famous statement that the path to Memphis and Thebes actually passes through Turin. However, in Turin, Champollion found his personal paradise. He spent 8 months at the museum, diligently studying papyri, which he described to his brother as being beyond all praise. He made remarkable discoveries while restoring the tiny fragments brought back from Egypt by Bernardino Drevetti. Today in Turin, we witness the same dedication displayed by Champollion, reflected in the actions of scientists restoring and piecing together papyri. It was within these very workshops, 2 centuries ago, that Champollion completed a work that would establish the groundwork for determining the timeline of the pharaonic dynasties. Establishing chronology was a principal focus for Champollion upon his arrival in Turin. Champollion was presented with an incredibly rich collection, unlike anything he had ever encountered before. Among the fragmented papyri that Champollion encountered was one listing royal names. Known as the Turin King List or the Papyrus of Kings, it's a roster of rulers, beginning from the era of the gods and extending into historical periods, and presumably up to the time of Ramesses II, during whose reign this list was compiled. The lengths of their reigns are preserved: 8 years for Amenemhat, 22 for Jedkare, and 30 for Unas. This document is one of the foundational historical texts in Egyptology. It's the only genuine and objective king list we possess. Within the museum's storage areas, Champollion excitedly uncovered more papyri. One document in particular captured his attention. A text written during the reign of Ramesses III, it recounts the story of the first documented labor strike in history concerning Amenemhat. The strike papyrus details the plight of workmen at Deir el-Medina who weren't receiving their wages, essentially their provisions, which prevented them from doing their jobs. They left the vicinity of Deir el-Medina to go to the Ramesseum to voice their complaints, saying, We demand our wages." Then they declared, "As long as we don't receive them, we will not work. We are laying down our wooden mallets and our copper chisels. We refuse to work. And if the king doesn't have a tomb, then we are truly facing the end of the world." This is because the king is the anchor of cosmic balance, the equilibrium between good and evil. Therefore, the king ensures the world's continuity, guaranteeing that the sun will rise each day. To achieve this, even after death, he requires a tomb to exist in the afterlife. So, the work they were performing was crucial for maintaining the cosmic order. With this papyrus, we mark the beginning of the end of a golden era. This signifies the start of the decline, the emergence of cracks within the system. And this is precisely the message this papyrus conveys. Champollion deciphered the Turin papyri with great enthusiasm, yet he still yearned to embark on the grandest adventure of his life, to journey up the Nile and into the heart of Nubia to refine his deciphering methods by studying hieroglyphs directly on the ancient monuments. This aspiration, which had captivated him since his youth, had taken shape while he examined certain plates in the description de l'Egypte, notably this one, depicting the Temple of Hathor at Deir el-Medina. It's a stunning illustration with a unique atmosphere, heightened by the priests in deep contemplation before the carvings. This provided Champollion with an initial, fairly accurate image of an Egyptian temple, complete with its inscriptions and artwork. However, he soon realized that he would need to personally correct the inscriptions on-site to ensure accurate readings. It would take him 2 years to realize his dream, to assemble an expedition comprising 14 scholars and scientists for an epic journey lasting 18 months, exploring the major ancient sites previously visited by Napoleon's expedition. It was an immense undertaking, but Champollion was more than capable of the task. The moment he arrived in Egypt in 1828, Champollion underwent a transformation. He earned the nickname the Egyptian. He grew a beard, carried a sword, and adopted Turkish attire. He wore a black cloth and a black cloth. He was given the nickname the Egyptian. He grew a beard, carried a sword, and dressed in Turkish clothing. He was eager to observe everything and produce the most systematic and detailed drawings and plans possible. Eager to share his awe at such beauty with his fellow countrymen, he returned to France with invaluable treasures, including sarcophagi and small statues unearthed from the tombs he explored. During his time in Thebes, he visited Deir el-Medina to compare his lifelong dream with the reality of the remarkably preserved ruins of the Temple of Hathor. The findings from Champollion's extensive expedition were eventually shared after his passing in the historical records of Egypt and Nubia. Here's an illustration of the Luxor obelisk, which was later relocated to Paris following Champollion's death. This impressive monument was put up in the Place de la Concorde back in 1836. It was actually Champollion himself who advocated for the Luxor obelisks to come to Paris, rather than the ones in Alexandria, which was the initial proposal. This particular obelisk is quite well known as it's one of a pair. The other one resides in Paris, and he journeyed to Egypt to examine the existing monuments and to correct details he'd observed in the description de l'Egypte and other publications. What he did was bring along illustrations from books that featured structures like this obelisk. He'd then compare these with the actual monument, make necessary corrections, and thus gain a true understanding of ancient Egyptian messages, which aided his study and knowledge of hieroglyphs. Champollion is recognized as the founder of Egyptology, not only for deciphering hieroglyphs but also for his significant contributions across various scientific fields. His work encompassed Egyptian religion, the Turin King list, and lists of pharaohs, among other important studies. By reconstructing and deciphering the Turin King list, Champollion provided us with the historical chronology of the early pharaonic kingdoms. though this record concluded with Ramses II. His successors continued to extend this timeline right up to the Roman era. This enabled Professor Trone K. to date the construction of TT33 to approximately the 7th century BCE. However, to fully understand the life of Padiamenipae, it's now crucial to definitively establish during which ruler's reign he served. It's quite puzzling how someone of such prominence never mentions his king or his tomb. Occasionally, he states, "I was a significant figure. The king of my time relied heavily on me." Yet he never names him. So who was this king? It was through studying the tomb adjacent to Padiamenipae's, TT34, belonging to Menkaper, and the king of the Roman period, the governor of Upper Egypt and mayor of Thebes in the 7th century BCE, provided Professor Trone K. with the solution to this mystery. Genuine authority was held for roughly a decade by Menkaper, the individual who constructed the large pylon you see behind me. How does Padiamenipae fit into this narrative? I believe they were roughly contemporaries. Or perhaps there's a decade separating them. This is because similar characteristics are found in Menkaper's tomb and Padiamenipae's tomb. Therefore, I propose that Padiamenipae served as a religious advisor to King Taharqa. Taharqa. In Delvla, we can admire depictions of the most celebrated king from the 25th dynasty. This was the era of the Black Pharaohs from the kingdom of Kush, the Kushite kings. The Nubian dynasty was already deeply influenced by Egyptian culture when it was established, as they originated from Sudan, Upper Nubia, which Egypt had previously colonized and where a significant cultural assimilation had occurred. Consequently, the Nubian aristocracy was well-versed in Egyptian customs and religious practices. They were, in a sense, more devoted to royal traditions than the established rulers, advocating for a return to original purity. The Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, who governed Egypt in the 8th century BCE, arrived to assert control and demonstrate their authority over Egypt, while also forging a connection with the great past. In earlier times, construction took place here. Although these columns are heavily damaged, we still find depictions of the king along with his name, allowing us to identify the builder. King Taharqa's name is inscribed within this cartouche, carved onto this column. He was responsible for the creation of this extensive architectural complex that leads to the Temple of Ammonius. Padiamenipae participated in this antiquity revival movement, which was quite fashionable then. He decorated his tomb with texts from the pyramids and sarcophagi, items not used for nearly 2,000 years, to showcase his scholarly background to visitors. A portion of his tomb was designed to attract intellectually curious visitors, and Padiamenipae served as the king's secretary at some point. The king's secretary? This would imply that Padiamenipae led ceremonies and stood in for the pharaoh during his absences. This peculiar ramp, leading down to the Nile, serves as evidence. It was constructed during Taharqa's reign. Under Padiamenipae's supervision, this discovery is based on an inscription that Professor Trone K. is currently deciphering in his tomb. I constructed a mooring area, which translates to a quay. This indicates he managed construction projects in Karnak. Furthermore, as a lector priest, he also oversaw ceremonies in Karnak. He refers to himself as he who conducted celebrations and ceremonies in the Temple of Karnak. Thus, he was a highly significant figure in local religious observance. And the grand culmination of these ceremonies was a major annual procession, known to the ancient Egyptians as the Beautiful Festival of the Valley. It commenced on the famous ramp descending to the Nile, the point of departure for the sacred bark of Ammonius Ra, which would embark on an extensive journey across the river to tour the necropolis. This is precisely why Padiamenipae chose to build his tomb in a location where the procession would pause annually. At the Temple of Luxor, an entire wall is dedicated to a comparable festival, the beautiful festival of Opet. It illustrates the remarkable scale of these processions. This was a colossal procession involving priests, animals brought for sacrifice, and dignitaries, including princes and princesses of Egypt, along with numerous priests, and, of course, the assembled populace. Spectators lined the banks and the processional route to witness the sacred bark of Ammonius being transported by all the priests. A vast quantity of offerings was presented to the god, and these were subsequently distributed to everyone attending the festival. And here you can see the god's bark resting within a shrine. Carrying it was, of course, quite a heavy task. Offerings would be made, prayers offered, and sometimes this was the populace's sole opportunity for direct interaction with the god, even though the god was somewhat obscured within the boat. You knew Ammonius was present. Then they would carry the bark, and a portion of it would proceed down the Nile. Musicians and dancers would perform along the entire route, singing praises to the gods. And here you can observe some of the musicians. There's a man with a drum, and there were also dancers performing stick dances, soldiers with their shields. You continue to see musicians, and over here you see dancers with their heads adorned. It's likely people also journeyed from surrounding regions to participate in this grand event. Padiamenipae played a crucial role in this entire interconnected system and control mechanism employed by the Nubian rulers. So, to Taharqa to Padiamenipae, it was Padiamenipae who effectively guided him through the understanding of Egypt's religion and its texts. Egyptologists have observed that numerous chapels within the Karnak complex, dedicated to the god Osiris, date back to the period of the Nubian pharaohs. It is challenging to precisely quantify Padiamenipae's influence on the resurgence of Osiris worship. However, for Salima Ikram, it's undeniable that the architectural style of these chapels served as a significant source of inspiration for Padiamenipae. Here are the 7 doorways of Osiris, which are said to lead to the afterlife. This would have been a central place of inspiration for individuals like the priest Padiamenipae, whose tomb stands as an extraordinary tribute to the god Osiris. The ancient Egyptians were deeply preoccupied with ensuring continued existence in the afterlife. Was this the reason Padiamenipae dedicated his tomb to the worship of Osiris? What was he hoping to receive from the god of the dead? A closer examination of his tomb's architecture offers some insights. Padiamenipae organized his tomb into several distinct areas. The first was undoubtedly accessible to all visitors, while the second section was exclusively for pilgrims devoted to the god Osiris. Imagine that we are not typical tomb tourists, but rather pilgrims coming to worship at the altar of Osiris. We proceed to the right. Access to this area requires a special key. I even wonder if there was an admission fee. Padiamenipae certainly had a shrewd mind. It's possible he designed a tomb that could generate income. Upon passing through this door, we enter the cenotaph chamber. What does the cenotaph represent? It resembles a tomb with all the decorative elements of that period, yet it contains no body. So, what did the pilgrims do once they arrived here? They would walk around singing hymns. I believe they would recite the texts inscribed at the top of the walls. Picture these individuals arriving here as pilgrims, completing the tour just as we are. Following Padiamenipae's intended path and making offerings to Osiris, but they are also here to learn. The tour functions as a kind of encyclopedia of local religious practices. Thus, the cenotaph served as a pilgrimage site for Osiris worshippers, but not exclusively. It was also here that the embalmers performed their symbolic rites. Within these 3 chapels, They reenacted the ritual of preparing the deceased's body for its journey into the afterlife. At the back of the doors in each chapel, there is a lengthy inscription of 5 or 6 columns. In this text, Padiamenipae provides considerable detail about his identity and his roles. So, he is present not as the deceased, but as an officiating priest serving the pilgrims. We are now in the first embalming chamber where the body was dried. At the opposite end of the passageway is the chapel where the body was bandaged. And in the center is where the mummy was adorned with amulets and other sacred items, creating a complete package with the embalmed body to facilitate rebirth. Rebirth. Opening the eyes. Once the embalmers had finished with the mummy, the priest would perform a final ritual, the opening of the mouth ceremony. Using a tool called an adze, the embalmer would touch the mummy's mouth, nose, ears, and eyes, enabling the deceased to breathe, eat, and drink, essentially allowing them to continue living in the afterlife. Everything here is symbolic. While the cenotaph is a symbolic tomb for Osiris, the 3 chapels also represent an allegorical embalming workshop. It was within this purely symbolic setting that Padiamenipae conducted the ceremonies associated with the worship of the god of the dead. It's an intriguing detail, much like the man himself. In conventional tomb architecture, the deceased completes their nightly journey in the east to be able to follow the rising sun each day. However, here, Padiamenipae excavated a passage that concludes with a false door facing north. Why this deviation? This direction is west, and this is east. Logically, all texts conclude in the east. So why this turn towards the north? There is a false door that would open to the north, allowing the deceased to depart in that direction. When examining the tomb's layout, there are no architectural impediments preventing a passage eastward, meaning there's no structural or material reason for this choice. In reality, the explanation lies directly above us on the second line before the crack, where we find a formula from the pyramid texts. Just before the crack on the second line are the names of what the Egyptians referred to as the indestructibles. These are the circumpolar stars, perpetually visible in the northern sky. Through this hieroglyphic incantation, Padiamenipae aimed to join the stars that eternally shine in the sky, regardless of the season. We can observe his desire for 2 distinct avenues to guarantee continued life after death, and we also witness his mastery of the most ancient texts. And it is truly remarkable how he managed to integrate his profound knowledge of ancient texts into the very architecture of the tomb. It's a very thin text. He is the famous scene awakening Osiris, which must have covered the entire wall. The central part features the goddess Iris. Before him is his son Horus, who is holding a symbol of life under his father's nose. The hieroglyphs say waking up is usually combined with another scene featuring 2 sunbows, with the sun god Harati and on several registers a whole series of deities or genies. A second shaft descends even further into a strange room which resembles a sarcophagus of the Old Kingdom. Technically, it's the last room in the tomb. Any pillagers entering here could go no further. Beyond here there is nothing. But it's a decoy. In fact, the real burial chamber is above. You have to smash the ceiling to discover Padiamenipae's true burial chamber. And when you do enter, it's a revelation. The decoration on the walls and ceiling of the chamber are worthy of the Sistine Chapel. With the help of Egyptologists, they have been virtually restored to their original state. Padiamenipae clearly wanted to conceal the entrance to this last room where he was probably buried. But as we found no remains of a sarcophagus, the latest hypothesis to be put forward is that his mummy was inside a wooden coffin placed on a funerary bed, possibly in the central part of the room. This hypothesis is based on the fact that on the eastern west walls of this chamber, between the niches which must have held statues, there are images of guardian genies, deities, who were supposed to protect Padiamenipae's body. The same guardian genies that featured to the left and right of awakening Osiris. So the hypothesis is that Padiamenipae wanted to reproduce a kind of three-dimensional awakening Osiris, in which Padiamenipae, on his funerary bed and surrounded by guardian genies, takes the place of Osiris. The final veil over the enigma of Padiamenipae has been lifted. Associating himself with a judge of the dead and receiving his blessing and good grace was undoubtedly the best guarantee of living eternally in the afterlife. Exploration of his tomb has revealed an extraordinary figure, a priest, a scribe, and a scholar who played a crucial role at the pharaoh's court. Despite the 2,500 years that separate them, Padiamenipae and Champerion shared the same universalist ambition of embracing an entire knowledge and an entire culture. In hindsight, one seems to place himself in the continuity of the other. Both of them wanted to pass on something they possessed. Padiamenipae wanted to pass on his knowledge of history, a much older history of his civilization, and Champerion wanted to discover and then pass on to his contemporaries all of those wonderful things he had discovered. Shortly after returning from his voyage to Egypt, Champerion fell ill. He died in Paris on March 4, 1832, aged 41. Despite his early passing, he left behind a vast body of work. By cracking the code of hieroglyphs, Champerion opened the great door to what would become Egyptology, which is still developing today and destined to know even greater developments. Today's Egyptologists have taken up the baton from the great disciple. The priority on their next campaigns will be to continue conserving the tomb and restoring its treasure in order to reveal the last secrets of Padiamenipae. Whether it's inside the tomb or through the countless texts left by the scribes of Dar el-Medina, they will discover more about the everyday lives of these distant ancestors. Our wonderment is yet to be fully satisfied. There is still so much to learn about this fabulous civilization.